The woods learned the truth long before anyone else did. They heard it in the sobbing wind that curled through the pines at night, in the floorboards that creaked beneath a single pair of boots pacing long after midnight, and in the cries that were too small, too new, to belong to the mountains themselves. In that Appalachian hollow, where the fog clung like a second skin and the sun rarely touched the ground, a family lived hidden from roads, laws, and mercy. From the outside, the cabin looked like every other forgotten structure swallowed by the forest, weather-beaten, leaning, quiet. But silence there was never empty. It pressed in, thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Neighbors told themselves it was none of their business. In these hills, secrets were currency, and asking questions had a way of getting people hurt or lost. Inside, a girl grew into womanhood without ever knowing what choice felt like. The man she called father was also the man who decided everything, when she slept, when she spoke, when she learned what love was supposed to mean. The woods were her only witnesses, their shadows stretching long and accusing as years passed and the unthinkable became routine. When the children came, they arrived quietly, wrapped in blankets and lies. No doctor signed their births. No church bells rang. Each child carried the weight of a sin they did not create, their eyes reflecting a fear too old for their age. The hollow watched them grow, watched the family sink deeper into itself, watched the truth rot beneath the floorboards. This was not just a story of one man's cruelty or one woman's suffering. It was a tragedy sealed by isolation, by a community that looked away, and by mountains that keep what they are given. Long after the cabin fell silent, the woods remembered. And they are still waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The hollow did not appear on most maps, and even those who lived within driving distance spoke of it as if it were a rumor rather than a place. Tucked deep between ridgelines where roads narrowed into ruts and cell signals died without warning, it existed beyond convenience and beyond concern. Travelers who took a wrong turn often turned back quickly, unsettled by the way the forest closed behind them, branches arching overhead like ribs. Locals said the land there swallowed sound. Voices carried strangely, and sometimes not at all, as though the woods decided which words deserved to be heard. For years, whispers clung to the name of one particular family living at the deepest bend of the hollow. No one could remember exactly when they had arrived. There was no story of inheritance, no clear origin, only the sense that they had always been there, folded into the land like a bruise beneath skin. Children were rarely seen, and when they were, they moved close together, eyes down, flinching at sudden noises. The adults never lingered in town. Supplies were bought quickly, conversations cut short, and questions met with stares sharp enough to silence even the curious. At night, when the fog crept down the slopes and pooled thick between the trees, strange sounds drifted toward neighboring cabins. Some claimed it was animals, others blamed the wind, but a few admitted in hushed tones that it sounded like crying, rising and falling, muffled as if trapped behind walls. Dogs refused to go near the old trail leading to the cabin. Horses spooked there, whites of their eyes flashing before bolting away as if sensing something their riders could not. Despite the unease, no one went to check. In the mountains, survival often depended on minding one's own business. People told themselves stories to make the discomfort manageable. The family was private. The family was strange but harmless. The family wanted to be left alone. Each excuse stacked neatly atop the next, forming a barrier stronger than any locked door. Over time, the whispers grew heavier, less speculative and more fearful. A midwife mentioned births that were never recorded. A hunter swore he saw small figures watching him from behind trees, their faces pale against the dark bark. Still, no authority ventured into the hollow, and no neighbor crossed the invisible line that separated suspicion from intervention. The forest stood between them, patient and unmoving, keeping its secrets as it always had, while the hollow earned a reputation not for what was known, but for what everyone sensed and chose not to name. From the time she could remember, the girl understood that the world was small and sharply defined, ending where the trees grew thickest and the path dissolved into leaf-choked ground. She was taught early that outside places were dangerous, filled with people who lied, stole, and punished children who did not belong to them. The hollow was presented as safety, the cabin as sanctuary, and the rules as protection rather than confinement. Questions were discouraged not with explanations, but with silence, the kind that made her feel foolish for asking in the first place. Her days followed a strict rhythm shaped by her father's moods and the seasons. She learned how to keep the fire fed, how to wash clothes in cold water until her hands burned, how to move quietly so as not to draw attention. Books were scarce, and the few she saw were treated like objects of suspicion. Knowledge, she was told, had a way of corrupting people, of turning children against their blood. Blood was sacred in the hollow, spoken of with reverence and warning in equal measure. Affection came in confusing forms, wrapped in language that blurred boundaries she was never taught to understand. She was praised for obedience, for loyalty, for staying close. Any attempt at independence was met with stories of girls who wandered off and were never seen again, their bones picked clean by animals or worse things that lived beyond the trees. Fear was a lesson repeated until it became instinct, settling into her bones as deeply as the cold. As she grew older, the isolation intensified rather than eased. There were no friends, no confidants, no moments unobserved. The outside world existed only through fragments overheard during rare trips into town, pieces of conversation that sounded unreal and dangerous. She learned to distrust strangers before she ever met one. Even the woods, once a place of quiet wonder, became a boundary she was warned never to cross alone. Silence became her most valuable skill. She learned how to swallow discomfort, how to lock thoughts away before they reached her mouth. Survival meant adapting to the reality presented to her, not questioning it. In that confined existence, love and control were intertwined so tightly that separating them seemed impossible. She did not know that what she lived was wrong, only that it was inevitable, that her role was pre-written and unchangeable. By the time she reached womanhood, the idea of choice felt like a myth told to other people, and blood, once described as destiny, had become a cage she could not see her way out of. As the years passed, his presence filled every corner of her life, expanding until there was no space left that did not belong to him. What began as watchfulness hardened into control, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He decided when doors stayed open and when they were shut, when light was allowed inside and when the cabin remained dim even at noon. His voice became the measure of safety, calm meaning peace, anger meaning danger, and she learned to read the smallest shifts in his tone the way others read weather signs. Rules multiplied without explanation. She was no longer allowed to wander the nearby woods, no longer permitted to linger by the creek. Even chores became supervised, his eyes following her movements as if she might vanish if left alone too long. He spoke often of threats she could not see, men who preyed on girls like her, authorities who would tear families apart without mercy. The world beyond the hollow was painted as cruel and corrupt, a place eager to punish loyalty and reward betrayal. Each warning pushed her further inward, shrinking her sense of self to fit the narrow life he allowed. Isolation was reinforced through repetition. If she questioned him, he reminded her of everything he had done to keep her alive, everything he could take away. Gratitude was demanded, framed as love, reinforced through fear. He told her no one else would ever understand her, that their bond was unique, stronger than ordinary family ties. Those words settled heavily in her mind, confusing affection with obligation until the difference disappeared entirely. Physical boundaries eroded slowly, disguised as necessity and care. She was taught that privacy was dangerous, that secrets invited ruin. When discomfort rose inside her, she pushed it down, convinced that unease was a personal failing rather than a warning. Resistance only made his grip tighter. Silence became survival, compliance a shield against worse outcomes she was made to imagine but never fully describe. Outside connections vanished completely. Trips to town stopped. Faces she once recognized faded into memory. The cabin became a closed system, self-contained and self-justifying, where his authority went unquestioned and unchallenged. The hollow itself seemed to conspire with him, dense trees blocking escape, distance erasing hope. Over time, her thoughts aligned with his, not because she agreed, but because disagreement had no language left to exist. By the time his control reached its deepest point, it felt less like imprisonment and more like fate, a condition as unchangeable as the mountains that surrounded them. The first pregnancy arrived quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement, announced not by words but by the way her body betrayed her confusion. She did not understand what was happening at first, only that she was constantly tired, that nausea came in waves, and that her dresses no longer fit the way they once had. When she finally spoke, haltingly, fear thick in her throat, his reaction was not shock but irritation, as though she had failed to keep something hidden long enough. He told her this was the natural order of things, that blood recognized itself, that the hollow had its own rules separate from the rest of the world. There was no doctor, no midwife called openly. Knowledge was passed down in fragments, instructions barked rather than explained. Pain was something to be endured silently, proof of strength rather than suffering. As her body changed, so did the walls around her. Windows were covered more carefully. The door was locked more often. She was no longer allowed outside alone at all. The woods, once a distant boundary, became an unreachable freedom she could see but never touch. When the child was born, it happened in the dead of night. The cries were smothered quickly, the moment stripped of any softness or celebration. There was no name spoken aloud at first, as if naming made things real in a way neither of them could afford. The baby was presented not as new life, but as consequence, as something to be managed rather than loved. She held the child with a mixture of instinct and terror, already sensing the weight that had been placed on its existence. The pregnancies did not stop. Each one followed the last with cruel inevitability, her body never fully recovering before being claimed again. With each birth, her world narrowed further. The children were kept hidden, taught early to be quiet, to stay close, to understand without explanation that their lives were not meant to be seen. Questions were discouraged before they were fully formed. The same lessons she had learned were passed down, fear replacing curiosity before it had a chance to grow. Neighbors noticed changes without understanding their cause. More laundry hung at odd hours. More smoke rose from the chimney. Sometimes, cries carried farther than they should have, quickly swallowed by distance and denial. Inside the cabin, exhaustion became permanent, etched into her face and posture. She stopped imagining an end, stopped counting years. Pregnancy became not an event but a condition, a cycle as relentless as the seasons, binding her and her children tighter to a secret that grew heavier with every breath, every birth, every night the woods listened and said nothing. The children grew in an atmosphere shaped by contradiction, surrounded by care that felt more like containment and affection that carried an edge of fear. From the moment they could move on their own, they were taught to stay close, their small hands often gripping one another as if instinctively aware that separation meant danger. Their laughter, when it surfaced, was quickly hushed, not out of discipline but necessity. Sound carried too far in the hollow, and attention was something to be avoided at all costs. There was an innocence to them that felt fragile, easily bruised by the strange gravity of their existence. They learned words late and sparingly, language filtered and controlled just as their mothers had been. Stories of the outside world were vague and ominous, filled with faceless threats and punishments. Curiosity flickered briefly in their questions, only to be extinguished by sharp looks or abrupt silence. Over time, they learned which thoughts were safe to keep and which needed to be buried before they surfaced. As they aged, subtle differences began to emerge, details that unsettled even those who loved them most. Their features carried a repetition that was hard to ignore, familiar angles mirrored too closely, expressions echoing one another in ways that felt unnatural. Some struggled with simple tasks, others with unexplained illnesses that came and went without pattern. Bruises appeared too easily. Fevers lingered. Weakness settled into their bones early, giving them an air of fragility that set them apart from other children in the region, had anyone been close enough to notice. Their mother watched these signs with growing dread, guilt twisting tighter each year. She tried to compensate in the only ways she knew how, through constant vigilance and quiet tenderness, though even love felt dangerous in a place where nothing existed freely. She sang to them softly at night, songs without endings, melodies meant to soothe without drawing attention. In those moments, the children seemed almost normal, their breathing sinking, their fears briefly eased. But the cabin itself seemed to press in on them, walls heavy with secrets, floors creaking under the weight of unspoken truth. They learned to read their father's moods as carefully as their mother once had, freezing when his voice sharpened, shrinking when his presence filled the room. Childhood passed quickly there, not marked by milestones but by survival. By the time the eldest began to understand that something about their family was different, wrong in ways they could not name, the sense of fear had already taken root deeply. Innocence remained, but it was altered, bent around a reality that demanded silence above all else, shaping them into children who sensed they were born into a story they were never meant to tell. The first signs were small enough to dismiss, easy to fold into the long tradition of minding one's own business that defined life in the mountains. A neighbor noticed that the cabin's windows stayed shuttered even on bright days, the curtains never shifting. Another remarked on the way the trail leading to the hollow looked less traveled yet somehow more worn, as if many feet passed through but never strayed far. At the general store, the man from the cabin stopped bringing a single sack of supplies and began hauling 2, then 3, always buying the same items in careful quantities, always avoiding conversation. Sounds carried farther than people wanted to admit. On certain nights, when the air lay still and the fog rolled low, cries drifted through the trees, high and thin, then abruptly cut off. Some said it was foxes. Others claimed owls made strange noises if you listened too closely. A few recognized the sound for what it was but swallowed the recognition whole, convincing themselves they were mistaken. Fear had a way of making explanations convenient. Children were glimpsed rarely, and when they were, it unsettled those who saw them. Small figures stood at the edge of the woods watching hunters pass, disappearing the moment they were noticed. Once, a woman swore she saw a child's face pressed briefly against a dusty windowpane before it vanished. Word spread quietly, never openly discussed, passed in lowered voices between chores and prayers. Each retelling softened the edges, turning concern into rumor rather than alarm. Disappearances added weight to the unease. A peddler who took the wrong path never returned. A neighbor's dog bolted toward the hollow and came back days later injured and terrified. Trails near the cabin seemed to twist unexpectedly, leading people in circles until they found themselves back where they started, disoriented and shaken. The woods around the hollow earned a reputation for swallowing those who lingered too long. Despite the signs, no one intervened. The idea of confronting what might be happening felt heavier than the guilt of ignoring it. People told themselves that families were complicated, that outsiders could not understand mountain ways. Authorities were distant, roads unreliable, and proof non-existent. What could they say, really, beyond feelings and half-seen shapes in the dark? So the windows stayed shut. The cries continued. The children remained unseen. The hollow settled deeper into its role as a place best avoided, its mystery reinforced by every step not taken toward it. In choosing distance, the community unknowingly became part of the silence, allowing fear to replace responsibility and rumor to stand in for truth, while whatever was happening behind those walls carried on undisturbed, hidden by trees, fog, and the collective decision to look away. The secret did not remain static, it festered, changing the shape of everything it touched. Inside the cabin, tension thickened until it felt alive, pressing against the walls and seeping into every interaction. Love, once spoken of as sacred and binding, curdled into something unrecognizable, used as justification rather than comfort. The man at the center of it all grew more volatile, his authority no longer rooted in control alone but in fear of exposure. Paranoia followed him like a shadow, turning every sound into a threat, every question into an accusation. The woman felt the decay long before she could articulate it. Guilt became constant, a dull ache that sharpened whenever she looked at her children. Their existence was proof of what had been done, and though she loved them fiercely, that love was tangled with shame and helplessness. She tried to protect them in small, desperate ways, keeping them close, softening words, absorbing anger meant for them whenever she could. But protection had limits inside a system designed to crush it. The children sensed the instability even without understanding its cause. Arguments erupted suddenly, voices raised and cut short, followed by long stretches of silence that felt more dangerous than shouting. They learned to disappear into corners, to make themselves small, to watch for signs that meant trouble was coming. The cabin no longer felt merely confined, it felt volatile, like something that could collapse inward at any moment. Trust eroded completely. The man no longer believed silence alone would keep him safe. He checked locks repeatedly, accused the woman of imagined betrayals, warned the children that speaking to anyone would destroy the family. The hollow, once a place of isolation, became a fortress ruled by suspicion. Even moments of calm were poisoned by anticipation, relief always temporary, never earned. The emotional rot began to show physically. Sleepless nights hollowed faces. Illness lingered. Meals grew sparse as resources were hoarded and rationed with increasing severity. The woman's body, already worn, seemed to fold inward under the weight of everything she carried. Still, she endured, driven by the belief that leaving would be worse, that survival meant staying, that endurance was the only form of resistance left to her. What had begun as a hidden crime transformed into a living nightmare sustained by fear, denial, and dependency. The family no longer functioned as one, it existed as fragments held together by terror and habit. Inside that cabin, love had become a weapon, silence a rule, and the secret of force so powerful it reshaped every breath they took, every thought they tried to bury, every day that passed without escape. The shift began subtly, almost invisibly, sparked by the smallest fracture in the routine that governed their lives. The eldest child, old enough to sense patterns and inconsistencies, began noticing details that no one explained. Reflections in cracked mirrors looked too similar. Stories changed depending on who was speaking. The warnings about the outside world grew more frantic, less convincing. Curiosity, long suppressed, resurfaced not as rebellion but as quiet observation, a need to understand what felt fundamentally wrong. The opportunity came unexpectedly during a rare moment of chaos. An argument erupted louder than usual, spilling outside the cabin walls, voices carrying farther than they ever had before. In that brief lapse of control, a door was left unlatched, a rule broken without intention. The child felt the opening before fully recognizing it, a sudden awareness that something different was possible. Fear was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath it stirred something unfamiliar, a fragile sense of agency. Preparation was instinctive rather than planned. Small items were hidden away over time, bits of food, a threadbare jacket, knowledge of which paths through the woods were least watched. The child listened carefully when adults spoke, memorizing details without understanding their importance until later. Each step toward escape felt dangerous, heavy with the possibility of punishment, but staying had begun to feel equally unbearable. When the moment came, it unfolded quickly. The forest was thick with fog, sound muffled, visibility poor. Heart pounding, the child slipped beyond the familiar boundary, every snapped twig sounding like a scream. The woods that had always loomed as a threat now offered concealment, shadows forming a temporary shield. Behind, the cabin remained dark and silent, unaware that something irreversible had begun. Discovery followed faster than expected. The absence was noticed, panic replacing control. Shouts cut through the trees, footsteps crashing through undergrowth. The chase was frantic, fueled by desperation rather than certainty. For the first time, the child understood the depth of the secret's power, how far it would go to preserve itself. The attempt did not unfold cleanly. Whether the child was caught or reached the edge of the hollow mattered less than what was set in motion. Suspicion spilled outward, cracks forming in the isolation that had once protected the family. Neighbors noticed unusual movement. A stranger glimpsed a figure emerging from the woods in distress. Questions were asked that could not be fully silenced. Inside the cabin, everything changed. Control tightened to a breaking point. Trust collapsed entirely. Fear turned inward and outward at once, transforming the secret from something hidden into something hunted. The attempt to escape, successful or not, marked the end of containment. From that moment on, the truth could no longer remain buried, and every choice that followed carried consequences that could not be undone. The fragments of truth emerged slowly, never in full, each piece carrying a weight that made the whole unbearable. Bones were found, small and scattered, hidden beneath floorboards and behind the cabin walls, as if someone had tried to erase evidence without knowing how. They told stories of lives lived and ended in silence, of children whose existence was marked only by absence. Letters, brittle and yellowed, appeared tucked into cracks and between pages of books that had never been read aloud, their words hinting at warnings ignored and secrets long held. Each artifact revealed more questions than answers, a puzzle assembled in shadows. Neighbors began to piece together their own incomplete observations, connecting glimpses and sounds that had seemed coincidental. A window left ajar. A cry that rose and fell, inexplicably. A trail of footprints in the snow leading nowhere. Individually, these incidents were easy to dismiss, but collectively, they painted a picture too grim to ignore. The Hollow, once a distant fear, became a locus of inquiry, its reputation transforming from rumor to undeniable horror. Survivors, those who had escaped or had been allowed to speak, offered testimony that was fragmented and unreliable, shaped by trauma and years of manipulation. They spoke in stutters, in whispered sentences, in moments when the memory became too heavy to contain. Details were repeated and contradicted, sometimes by the same speaker, but a pattern emerged nonetheless. A family trapped in its own history, bound by coercion, fear, and a perverse understanding of loyalty. What had been hidden for decades began to unfold in glimpses, each revelation heavier than the last. Investigators and outsiders who attempted to document the events were met with obstruction and silence. The cabin had been abandoned by then, the forest reclaiming what was left behind. Paths were overgrown, evidence disturbed by time and the elements. Yet what remained, letters, bones, scorched marks on the hearth, was enough to confirm the worst suspicions. Even without complete clarity, the scale of the tragedy was apparent, a testament to a family torn apart from within and left to rot beneath the cover of isolation. The truth, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. The Hollow carried it in echoes, in broken structures, in the strange quiet that persisted where life and death had collided. It revealed the cost of secrecy, the danger of isolation, and the way a family could decay from the inside while the world looked away. Pieces of the story lingered, not fully resolved, leaving a sense of unfinished horror that demanded attention yet resisted comprehension, as though the mountains themselves were reluctant witnesses to what had occurred. Long after the cabin fell into ruin, the Hollow remained alive with memory, its trees and streams carrying the weight of what had happened within. The community surrounding it spoke of the place in hushed tones, careful to avoid saying too much, careful to avoid drawing the attention of forces they could neither see nor fully comprehend. Travelers who passed nearby felt an inexplicable unease, a pressure that made the hairs on their necks rise, as if the woods themselves were warning them away. Silence persisted, thick and unbroken, a tangible presence that seemed to swallow sound and thought alike. Stories that survived were fragmented, passed down in whispers rather than written accounts, as though even recounting the events allowed risked awakening the memories embedded in the land. Some spoke of cries carried by the wind, faint and haunting, that seemed to rise and fall without origin. Others told of glimpses of small figures moving through the fog, fleeting and indistinct, vanishing before anyone could reach them. The Hollow itself had become a vessel for the past, storing it in every creaking branch, every moss-covered rock, and every shadow that lingered longer than it should. The children, those who had been born into the secret, left traces that could not be ignored. Even when absent, their presence was felt through objects abandoned in haste, worn paths leading nowhere, and the occasional whispered recollection from a neighbor too frightened to speak freely. Their existence, intertwined with a tragedy that no one dared fully acknowledge, became part of the landscape, inseparable from the thick forest that had hidden them for so long. The land bore witness to more than just human suffering, it carried the moral weight of silence. Generations of neighbors who had looked away had allowed the horror to persist, and their avoidance had become another layer of the Hollow story. Each step taken by a stranger, each footfall on the hidden trails, reminded them that some truths linger long after the acts themselves have ended. Nature itself seemed complicit, reclaiming buildings, obscuring evidence, and shaping the terrain to guard the Hollow's darkest secrets. Even as years passed, curiosity drew some toward the site, though none stayed long. Those who ventured too close spoke of a sense of being watched, of whispers that carried no words but carried meaning all the same. Fear was embedded so deeply in the air that it clung to the skin, invisible yet undeniable. The Hollow had become more than a place, it was a reminder, a monument to what can happen when secrecy, isolation, and unspoken violence intersect. Its silence was heavy, its memories unyielding, and its lessons impossible to ignore for those who dared to approach, leaving a legacy of dread and unanswered questions that would persist indefinitely, haunting the land and anyone who tried to understand it.